In late September of 2001, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters began airing in the United States and almost immediately became a cultural phenomenon. The main focus of the show was the titular card game, and its massive success in America guaranteed that a physical version of Duel Monsters would hit store shelves in the near future. The game had already taken off in Japan and proven its potential market value, and so after making a deal with Konami to acquire the Yu-Gi-Oh! License, Upper Deck Entertainment sought to capitalize on the show's popularity and bring the game to a Western audience. And while I'm sure both Upper Deck and Konami were expecting the game to be successful, since its target audience was probably the anime's fan base of kids and teenagers, I don't think they, or anyone really, could have anticipated that Yu-Gi-Oh! Would go on to become one of the most complex popular card games of all time, with a history and lore 18 years in the making and just as deep as the one present in the anime and manga it was based on. While the only experience many people have with Yu-Gi-Oh! Comes from playing the game casually when they were younger, behind the scenes there has always been a fiercely competitive, dynamic, and perpetually evolving metagame. This is the story of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s competitive landscape, and how its many eras were defined by the strategies that dominated it, cards that would take the game by storm, and most importantly, its base of dedicated, creative players both willing and able to push the game to its absolute limit. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game made its debut outside of Japan in March of 2002 with the release of Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, and just like the anime had about 6 months before this, the game almost immediately exploded in popularity.
Pretty much everyone started playing it. Like, it wasn't just a nerd thing, it wasn't just like a weird person thing. The people that were playing sports were doing it. I mean, boys and girls were all playing it. Pretty much the entire classroom was playing it.
At this point though, the game's appeal, while widespread, was still mostly casual, so there was no metagame to speak of yet.
There was no rule book or anything. LOB didn't really come with anything except packs, so you really had to talk to the store owner to really get some info about the game.
It really was like the recess meta. None of us had sleeves, none of us really had deck boxes. You got the rubber band around your deck in like a plastic baggie.
Fortunately, this initial Wild West period was pretty brief. Towards the end of the month, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game saw another major release, and the roots of the competitive game began to take shape. Although the Legend of Blue Eyes booster set was responsible for introducing many people to the game, the release of the Kaiba and Yugi starter decks was what really propelled it into the mainstream.
Yugi Kaiba format, that's like when, a lot of people first got into the game, they got their starter decks.
The most important thing about these starter decks is that they gave all potential players access to the game's official rulebook. This, of course, allowed a competitive scene to even exist in the first place, and while the overwhelming majority of Yu-Gi-Oh's players were casual ones, local tournaments were already being held at various game shops, and many players showed a clear interest in not only building the most powerful deck, but playing that deck the most optimally.
I'm told that this is a cross of chess and Pokemon. How exactly does one play Yu-Gi-Oh?
One could, at this point, describe Yu-Gi-Oh's rules as simple. Simple enough, anyway, that many people were able to pick up the basics just by watching the anime.
See, each card has an attack number and a defense number. First player to eliminate their opponent's life points wins the duel.
Like many other trading card games, Yu-Gi-Oh is built around the idea of stripping another player of a vital resource, in this case, life points. The most straightforward and typically the most effective way to decrease a player's life points has always been to deal damage by attacking with monster cards. Unless stated otherwise, all monsters have the inherent ability to declare an attack either on an opposing player or on another monster, and a monster's attack point score is indicative of how much damage it deals when attacking and how powerful it is relative to other monsters. Given the landscape of the early game, it may have actually been true at this point that this attack point score was the most important thing about a monster. Following the release of both starter decks, the card pool was still fairly limited. While Legend of Blue Eyes brought a whopping 126 cards into the game, many of them were almost completely useless.
Because LOB, the cards were just awful. Monsters didn't even have effects. The only true effect monster was Exodia's head.
87 of these 126 cards were monster cards, and of those, 82 were either normal monsters or fusion monsters with no effect. Starter decks Yugi and Kaiba collectively added 59 more cards into the card pool, and 35 of them were also normal monsters. This meant that most of the available monsters were clearly and undeniably worse than the truly exceptional few worth playing.
La Jin was like a beast. 1800 beatdown, let's go.
La Jin, the mystical genie of the lamp, was a level 4 monster with 1800 attack points, making it the most powerful monster a player could summon without tributing other monsters. Since the game prohibited players from playing any more than 3 copies of the same card in their deck, other weaker monsters like Neo the Magic Swordsman and Battle Ox, level 4 monsters with 1700 attack, were played alongside La Jin as they provided more consistent access to powerful monsters that could be normal summoned immediately. Giant Soldier of Stone and even occasionally monsters like Aquamador and Mystical Elf saw play due to their high defense values. 2000 was, after all, the highest baseline stat printed on a level 4 or lower monster by far, but cards like these could typically only be used defensively, or as setup for the future summon of a monster like Summon Skull.
Summon Skull! Attack!
Summon Skull was very strong, 1 tribute monster that was the same attack as a Dark Magician.
While it certainly would have been cool if the format had been split between people playing Dark Magician and people playing Blue Eyes, Dark Magician was made obsolete by the level 6 Summon Skull. Summon Skull had, without a doubt, more attack points than any other 1 tribute monster in the game, and was even more powerful than many 2 tribute monsters like Gaia the Fierce Knight and Red Eyes Black Dragon. Blue Eyes, on the other hand, was, with no caveat, no asterisk, the most powerful monster in the game, but this came at the cost of it being much more difficult to summon than Summon Skull. Summon Skull was the more likely of the two to actually make its way onto the field, but if a person could manage to summon Blue Eyes, there wasn't a single monster that could kill it in battle aside from another copy of Blue Eyes. While these powerful normal monsters were the bread and butter of most early decks, they weren't the only monsters that saw competitive play. As few of them as there were, effect monsters did exist at this point, but many of them had effects that just weren't powerful enough to make up for their lackluster stats. Of the 13 available effect monsters, only 4 were truly useful, and even though it was still powerful, the weakest of these 4 was probably Hain. Hain, like many other early effect monsters, has a flip effect, meaning that its effect only activates whenever it's flipped face up, either by the person who initially summoned it face down, or as a result of being attacked while face down. Hain's effect allows a player to put any monster on the field back in the hand of its owner, which again was fairly powerful, but it was in most cases a strictly worse version of either Wall of Illusion or Maneater Bug. Wall of Illusion was arguably the best of the 4, as it had both a powerful effect and a respectable stat line. Its 1850 defense stat made it powerful enough to survive being attacked by anything that could be summoned without tributing, and on top of that, it would always at least temporarily remove anything that tried to kill it from the field. It effectively served the same purpose as Hain, but unlike Hain, it would usually remain on the field after being attacked due to its high defense stat, and it was also able to remove multiple monsters from the field, since its effect was not a flip effect and instead went off whenever it was attacked, even if the attack destroyed it, and even if it had already used the effect before. This made removing it from the field through battle incredibly annoying, as the only monsters powerful enough to do it had to be tribute summoned, and even if they were able to destroy the Wall of Illusion, they would be returned to the hand afterwards, and their owner would need to go through the process of tribute summoning them all over again. Maneater Bug and Trapmaster, the last of these 4, were, like Hain, flip monsters with removal-based effects. They actually seem to be part of a 3-card series along with Armed Ninja, as each of their effects targeted and destroyed one of the game's 3 core kinds of cards: monsters, magic cards, and trap cards. Nobody played Armed Ninja because most powerful magic cards weren't worth setting face down, and with the sole exception of Swords of Revealing Light, didn't remain on the field after being activated. The ability to destroy monsters and trap cards, on the other hand, was extremely powerful, and more than made up for the pitiful attack and defense scores of both Maneater Bug and Trapmaster. Maneater Bug, Legend, and Wall of Illusion were the game's first true staple monsters, and found their way into many decks, both competitive and casual alike. Trapmaster wasn't quite as omnipresent as any of these cards, but it was still popular among competitive players due to the power of trap cards. Trap cards offered the unique benefit of being usable during either player's turn, and were usually designed to take advantage of this. There were only 9 of them released between the first booster set and both starter decks, but a surprising number of them were actually pretty good. Without a doubt, the best of them were Trap Hole and Wabaku, cards that were so good that pretty much anyone who played the game ran both at 3. Trap Hole was one of the most reliable forms of monster removal in the game, and was particularly useful against monsters that needed to be tribute summoned. Wabaku, meanwhile, was one of the only cards in the game that offered players any sort of protection from their opponent, and it was pretty good protection at that. It essentially skipped the other player's battle phase after being activated, and since it could be activated at almost any point during either player's turn, stopping it was really difficult. Another trap card that was extremely popular, but not quite as good as either of these two, was Reinforcements. The focus placed on attack points and the battle phase during this period allowed this card to shine. As good as the game's few viable trap cards were, however, they couldn't compete with the power of what was easily the best kind of card in the game: magic cards. Like trap cards, magic cards had effects that were, at the time, typically much more powerful than those given to monsters. Unlike trap cards and even flip monsters, however, magic cards can be activated immediately, with no setup at all required from the player. This made them inherently more powerful than most monsters and traps for the simple fact that they were much, much faster. Two of the most popular early magic cards were Fissure and Swords of Revealing Light. These two were pretty similar in function to Trap Hole and Wabaku respectively. One could get rid of a monster, and the other was a powerful stalling card. Both saw about as much success as the staple trap cards of the era, but they were far from the best magic cards in the game. They were completely eclipsed by another group of cards, often referred to as the Power 5. These weren't just the most powerful magic cards in the game. They were, by a wide margin, the most powerful cards in the game.
I mean, these cards are iconic, right?
Those are like classic.
Any deck that included them was better for it, and so they were played by pretty much anyone who had access to them. They were so powerful, and so widely used, in fact, that they led to the creation of the game's first Forbidden and Limited list, where many of them have remained for the entire life of the game. The first edition of this list went into effect at the beginning of May, but it didn't actually ban any cards. 10 cards were limited and 2 were semi-limited. The first 5 cards to be placed in the limited section were the 5 pieces of Exodia. While these cards did act as an alternate win condition, they have almost never been at the center of any of the game's most powerful decks. It was probably for the best that they were placed here, but it's hard to say that this had a substantial effect on the metagame. What ended up being far more impactful was the decision to limit the previously mentioned Power 5 magic cards.
I can completely understand why these cards were all limited in the context of 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh! Just because these are game/format warping cards for the time. When you have a card that literally just says destroy all monsters on your opponent's field, it's crazy, right? And it's so funny that a card that literally just says draw 2 cards was limited, but like now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Sense is banned. That just goes to show how powerful drawing cards is in this game.
The 2 cards placed in the semi-limited section were also magic cards. While card destruction was not omnipresent in the early metagame, it may have been problematic if everyone could play 3 copies of it in their deck. This card in multiple quantities hypothetically makes it very easy to force another player to lose by decking out, and that aside, it was also occasionally played as a powerful draw card since Pot of Greed was now limited. Swords was a pretty big deal because unlike Wabaku, it allowed players to stall for 3 turns instead of just 1.
Like, stalling 3 turns was like, oh, I can draw into my Raigeki.
This ban list was the last major event of Yu-Gi Kaiba format, which meant that the game was able to stabilize over the course of the next month. With Dark Hole and Raigeki limited, Fissure had become the most consistent way to get monsters off of the field with a card effect. It was one of the most reliable ways to get rid of a Wall of Illusion without attacking it, and it also made committing to a tribute summon too early very risky, which led many players to wait to summon their deck's boss monster until they had at least 2 monsters already on the field. This is one of a handful of reasons that Summon Skull Beatdown ultimately became the best deck of the format. Setting up a field of 3 monsters before summoning the Blue Eyes was pretty tough, and in many cases, even if a player properly played around Fissure, their Blue Eyes would just get destroyed by Trap Hole, or perhaps even Raigeki or Dark Hole. For this reason, those truly dedicated to making Blue Eyes work often played Lord of D and the Flute of Summoning Dragon, cards that could help bypass the need to tribute monsters entirely. A handful of other cards were experimented with and saw scattered success throughout this period, but none would stick around for long. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was on the verge of its first major shakeup, brought about by the June release of its next core booster set. Metal Raiders added a staggering 144 cards to the game, and thus nearly doubled the available card pool. Of course, not all 144 were actually good, but given the sheer volume of new cards, the game was bound to see a noticeable leap in power. While beatdown decks, and Summon Skull beatdown decks in particular, continued to dominate the meta, the cards added in Metal Raiders almost completely changed how these decks, and the game in general, were played. Surprisingly, this set's magic cards were actually largely overshadowed by many of its new traps, which brought with them the idea of a brand new form of interaction, negation.
You activated my trap card actually started to matter.
Unlike, for example, Trap Hole and Wabaku, these were not cards meant to respond to one action or effect with another. The purpose of these new cards was to prevent certain things from happening entirely. There were 5 new cards with a negation clause in this set, and 4 of them in particular were designed to negate individual cards. All of them were counter trap cards, meaning that they couldn't be responded to once they were activated, except with other counter trap cards, and they all allowed the player to trade some of their resources in order to completely negate the activation or summon of another card. What's interesting is they all asked the player for something different in exchange. They all had a different cost, and because of this, Solemn Judgment and Horn of Heaven saw very limited play.
A lot of people did not like Solemn Judgment during its original release. Like, it's the Omni Negate, but you have to pay half your life points.
I think it's fascinating that this didn't just become like a staple immediately out of the gate. Like, I think looking back, some people are probably just like, I don't know why we just weren't all running 3 of this just because of how powerful the card it is.
They valued life points a lot more because it was just a race at the time. It wasn't about maintaining a solid position as much.
Magic Jammer and 7 Tools of the Bandit, on the other hand, did see immediate and widespread success, with Magic Jammer being the more popular of the two. Despite how good many of these new traps were, the Power 5 were still the best cards in the game, and negating any of them was typically better than negating another trap card.
Like, oh, but what if they Raigeki me and I spent all this time setting up my entire field and they're just gonna destroy it all? Then they started to realize, hey, I can use stuff in my hand to kind of substitute the destruction.
That said, there was one new trap card in this set that could give the Power 5 a run for their money. Mirror Force also had a negation clause. It negated monster attacks, but what was much more important was after it negated the attack.
Mirror Force is just, it's a board wipe, but it's a board wipe that you get to use on your opponent's turn, which I think what was so appealing about it.
Especially with Mirror Force, where people have to manage the resource, not overcommit. That's when that evolution started to really take place in TCG anyway.